December 26, 1996. Six-year-old beauty pageant contestant JonBenét Ramsey is found dead in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado. Within hours, the case explodes into international headlines. A mysterious ransom note, no signs of forced entry, and a crime scene that investigators would later describe as deeply disturbing. For nearly 3 decades, the question has haunted investigators and the public alike. Was this the work of a calculated intruder, or did the truth lie much closer to home? Now, after 29 years of controversy, mistakes, and unanswered questions, investigators say new revelations may finally bring us closer to the truth. But to understand what really happened that night, we have to go back to the very beginning. Before the headlines, before the investigations, before one of the most controversial murder cases in American history, there was simply a little girl. Her name was JonBenét Ramsey. She was born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, into what many would describe as a successful and privileged American family. Her father, John Ramsey, was a wealthy businessman and technology executive. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, was a former beauty queen who had once held the title of Miss West Virginia. To outsiders, the Ramseys appeared to be living the American dream. By the mid-1990s, the family had moved to Boulder, Colorado, settling into a large home in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Friends described the Ramseys as active in the community, socially connected, and deeply involved in their children's lives. But one member of the family in particular was quickly becoming known far beyond their neighborhood. At just 6 years old, JonBenét had already become a rising star in the world of child beauty pageants. Dressed in sparkling costumes, styled hair, and full stage makeup, she competed in competitions across the country, often performing dance routines and modeling elaborate outfits in front of judges and cheering audiences. To many spectators, she looked like a miniature celebrity. Photos and videos of her performances would later flood television screens around the world, and that visibility would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because when news of JonBenét's death broke in December 1996, those pageant images, smiling, polished, and seemingly perfect, were suddenly juxtaposed with a horrifying reality. A 6-year-old child had been murdered inside her own home. The contrast shocked the nation and ignited endless speculation. Who would target a little girl like JonBenét Ramsey? Was her public life somehow connected to the crime, or was the truth hidden much closer to home? Investigators would soon discover that the events leading up to that Christmas night were far more complicated than anyone first believed. And what happened inside the Ramsey house on December 25, 1996, would become one of the most debated mysteries in modern criminal history. But to understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to look at the night that changed everything. December 25th. 1996, Christmas Day. Inside the Ramsey home in Boulder, Colorado, the holiday had unfolded just like it did for millions of families across America, filled with gifts, laughter, and celebration. 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey spent the morning opening presents with her family, surrounded by the warmth and excitement that typically defines Christmas morning. According to family accounts later given to investigators, the day was calm, festive, and seemingly uneventful. But that evening, the Ramseys had plans. According to police reports, John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and their children attended a Christmas party at the home of family friends. The gathering was described as relaxed and cheerful, neighbors celebrating the holiday season together. Witnesses later told investigators that nothing about the Ramseys' behavior that night appeared unusual. JonBenét reportedly played with other children. Adults talked, laughed, and shared food. To everyone present, it looked like an ordinary Christmas evening, but sometime later that night, the Ramseys returned to their large home in Boulder. According to statements later given to police, JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car during the drive home. When they arrived, John Ramsey carried his daughter upstairs and placed her into bed. It would be the last time she was reportedly seen alive. Everything about the moment seemed routine. No signs of fear, no indication of danger, no warning that anything was wrong. In fact, according to investigators reviewing the timeline later, the house appeared completely quiet as the family settled in for the night. But somewhere inside that home, something would soon go terribly wrong, because within just a few hours, the peaceful Christmas night would transform into one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. And the first clue that something was terribly wrong wouldn't come from screams or broken windows or forced entry. It would come from a note. A note that investigators would later describe as one of the strangest pieces of evidence ever found at a crime scene. And what it said would launch a mystery that remains unsolved nearly 30 decades later. Early in the morning of December 26, 1996, something unusual caught the attention of Patsy Ramsey. As she walked down the staircase inside the Ramsey home in Boulder, Colorado, she noticed several pages of paper lying on the steps. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary note, but within seconds, Patsy realized it was anything but ordinary. According to her later statement to investigators, the handwritten message claimed that her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, had been kidnapped, and whoever wrote it was demanding money. A lot of it. The note stretched across 2.5 pages, far longer than the typical ransom demand investigators usually encounter in kidnapping cases. But what truly caught the attention of detectives wasn't just the length of the letter. It was the details inside it. The writer claimed to represent a small foreign faction. They warned John Ramsey not to contact police, and they threatened that any mistake could result in JonBenét's immediate execution. Then came the demand, exactly $118,000. To experienced investigators, that number immediately stood out. Not because it was large, but because it was oddly specific. According to later reports, $118,000 was almost identical to the Christmas bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. That raised an unsettling possibility. Was the kidnapper someone who knew the family personally? Or was it simply a coincidence? But the mystery surrounding the note didn't end there. Forensic analysts soon made a discovery that made the situation even stranger. The ransom letter hadn't been brought into the house by an intruder. Instead, it appeared to have been written inside the Ramsey home itself. According to forensic analysts, the paper and pen used to write the message were believed to come from inside the house. In other words, whoever wrote the note may have spent time inside the home before leaving it on the staircase. And that detail triggered a wave of disturbing questions. Would a kidnapper really sit down inside a victim's house and calmly write a 2.5-page letter? Behavioral analysts later noted that most ransom notes are written quickly, often before the crime even takes place. But this one was different. Long, dramatic, almost theatrical. Some experts began to suspect the note might not be a kidnapping demand at all, but something else entirely. A staged message, a misdirection, a carefully constructed attempt to control the narrative of what happened inside the Ramsey home that night. But investigators still had one massive problem. At the time the note was discovered, no one had actually seen JonBenét. She was simply missing, or at least that's what everyone believed. Because what police would soon discover inside the house would completely change the direction of the investigation and turn a suspected kidnapping into something far more disturbing. At 5:52 a.m. on December 26, 1996, the quiet morning in Boulder, Colorado was suddenly interrupted by a frantic emergency call. On the other end of the line was Patsy Ramsey. Her voice was shaking, panicked, barely able to form sentences. According to the official 911 recording later released to investigators, Patsy urgently told the dispatcher that her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, was missing. And there was something else, a ransom note. Patsy told the operator that the letter claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped from inside the family's home. The caller's voice grew more frantic as she tried to explain what she had found on the staircase. "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please," she reportedly pleaded. Within minutes, police were dispatched to the Ramsey residence. According to investigators, officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived quickly at the large family home. At first, the situation appeared to be exactly what the ransom note described, a kidnapping. But, as investigators would later explain, several unusual decisions had already complicated the scene. Despite the warning written in the ransom note not to contact authorities, police had been called immediately. And even before officers arrived, the Ramseys had reportedly contacted friends and neighbors, asking them to come to the house for support. Soon, multiple people were moving throughout the residence: friends, family members, officers. To investigators looking back on the case years later, this moment would become critically important, because crime scenes, especially potential kidnapping scenes, depend heavily on preserving evidence. But on this morning, the Ramsey house quickly became crowded, and with every person walking through the home, the possibility of contaminating evidence increased. At the time, however, no one yet understood the full gravity of the situation, because investigators still believed they were dealing with a missing child, a kidnapping. And, according to the ransom note, the kidnapper would soon make contact. The letter claimed that John Ramsey would receive a phone call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. with instructions for delivering the money. So the house waited. Police waited. The Ramseys waited. But as the clock moved closer to 8 a.m., something strange happened. The phone never rang. And as investigators began searching the home more carefully, one discovery inside the basement would soon transform this case from a suspected kidnapping into one of the most disturbing murder investigations in American history. Because JonBenét Ramsey had never left the house. The morning of December 26, 1996 began as what investigators believed was a kidnapping case. Police officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived at the Ramsey residence in Boulder, Colorado, shortly after the frantic 911 call placed by Patsy Ramsey. She had reported that her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, was missing, and there was a ransom note. At first, the situation appeared straightforward. A possible kidnapping had occurred sometime during the night, and investigators began treating the home as the starting point of a search for a missing child. But very quickly, detectives realized the situation inside the house was far from controlled. Friends, family members, and neighbors had already arrived, offering support to the Ramseys. People were moving between rooms, making phone calls, comforting each other, and trying to make sense of what had happened. To experienced investigators, this immediately raised a concern. Crime scenes are fragile. Every step, every fingerprint, every displaced object can alter the evidence, and on that morning, the Ramsey home had already become crowded. Still, officers began a preliminary search of the property. According to investigators, they initially conducted only a limited sweep of the property, checking rooms where a child might be hiding or where signs of forced entry might appear. Nothing obvious stood out. There were no broken windows, no doors forced open, and, perhaps most puzzling of all, there were no clear signs that someone had broken into the home during the night. For detectives trained to recognize patterns in kidnappings, that detail was unsettling. If a kidnapper had taken JonBenét, how had they entered, and more importantly, how had they left? But for several hours that morning, the investigation remained focused on the assumption that the JonBenét had been taken. Then, around midday, something changed. A detective on the scene reportedly asked John Ramsey and a family friend to conduct another search of the home. The request was simple: start at the top of the house and work your way down, looking for anything unusual. At the time, no one expected what would happen next. John Ramsey began walking through the lower levels of the home. Eventually, he made his way toward the basement. The Ramsey basement was large and divided into several storage areas, rooms used for household items, holiday decorations, and storage. One of those rooms had a heavy wooden door. It was sometimes referred to as the wine cellar. According to later accounts, John Ramsey approached the door and opened it. Inside the small basement room, the lighting was dim, but within seconds he saw something on the floor. It was the body of his daughter. 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was lying on the ground inside the room. According to investigators, she had been bound and covered with a blanket. In that moment, the entire investigation changed. The kidnapping theory collapsed instantly. JonBenét had never left the house. Instead of a missing child case, police were now standing inside an active homicide scene. But what happened next would later become one of the most controversial moments in the entire investigation. According to witness accounts, John Ramsey immediately picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs. He brought her into the main area of the house, placing her on the floor before investigators and friends who were still inside the residence. For detectives, the scene was chaotic. In most homicide investigations, preserving the body exactly where it is found is critical. The surrounding area can contain fibers, footprints, biological evidence, and subtle clues that reveal what happened. But in this case, that environment had already been disturbed. And once the body was moved, the original crime scene was permanently altered. Years later, many investigators would describe this moment as a devastating blow to the case, because critical forensic evidence may have been lost forever. But the discovery of JonBenét's body raised even more disturbing questions. If she had been inside the house the entire time, then who was responsible? An intruder who somehow entered the home without leaving obvious signs? Or someone already inside that night? Forensic examiners would soon begin analyzing the details of the crime scene, the injuries, the bindings, the positioning of the body, and what they discovered during the autopsy would reveal that the crime was even more brutal than anyone initially realized. But perhaps the most chilling detail of all was that several clues found in the basement suggested the killer may have spent significant time inside the house after the attack, which raises a question investigators have debated for nearly 30 decades. Was this the work of a calculated outsider, or was the truth hiding much closer to the Ramsey family than anyone wanted to believe? Because the evidence investigators uncovered next would ignite one of the most controversial debates in true crime history. The discovery of the body of JonBenét Ramsey inside her family's home immediately shifted the investigation from a kidnapping to a homicide. Within hours, forensic experts began the grim process of determining exactly how the 6-year-old had died. Her body was transported from the Ramsey residence in Boulder, Colorado, to the coroner's office, where a full autopsy would be conducted. At first glance, investigators already knew they were dealing with a violent crime. But the medical examination would reveal something far more disturbing than anyone had expected. According to the official autopsy report, the cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In simpler terms, JonBenét had suffered two separate and devastating injuries. a severe blow to the head, and strangulation. But the sequence of those injuries would quickly become one of the most debated questions in the entire case. During the examination, forensic pathologists discovered a massive fracture in JonBenét's skull. The injury was extensive, running several inches across her head. Yet strangely, there was very little visible bleeding externally. To investigators, that detail suggested the blow may have occurred shortly before death, possibly rendering her unconscious. Some medical experts later theorized that the head injury alone could have been fatal. But there was another injury that investigators could not ignore. Wrapped around JonBenét's neck was a garrote, a crude strangulation device constructed from a cord tied to a broken wooden paintbrush handle. The cord had been pulled tight enough to cause fatal asphyxiation. Forensic examiners concluded that the strangulation played a direct role in her death. The brutality of the device shocked investigators. Garrotes are rarely seen in typical domestic crimes. They require time to assemble. They require deliberate action. And in many cases, they are associated with offenders who want to exert control over their victims. That detail immediately raised troubling questions. Was this the work of someone experienced with violent methods? Or was the device assembled in a moment of panic by someone attempting to stage a crime scene? But the medical examination would reveal something far more disturbing than anyone had expected. Evidence suggested that JonBenet may have been sexually assaulted. According to forensic findings, they were injuries consistent with sexual trauma. For investigators, this discovery introduced a completely new dimension to the case. Now the crime could potentially involve sexual motivation, which significantly changed how behavioral analysts began to profile the possible offender. According to criminal psychologists, crimes involving sexual violence against children often point towards offenders with specific psychological patterns. Some offenders are driven by compulsive sexual impulses. Others commit the act as part of a larger pattern of control, domination, or sadistic behavior. But in this case, investigators faced an unusual contradiction. Many crimes involving sexual predators occurred during kidnappings or abductions, yet JonBenet had never left the house. That meant whoever committed the crime had access to the home and time to carry out the attack. Which brought investigators back to one of the most troubling questions in the case. Was this an intruder who had secretly entered the Ramsey house during the night, or could the person responsible have already been inside the home? Forensic analysts also examined the materials used to construct the garrote. The cord itself appeared ordinary, but the wooden handle used as the tightening mechanism came from something very specific. Investigators later determined it was likely part of one of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrushes from her art supplies inside the house. At first, that detail might have seemed insignificant, but to detectives it quickly became one of the most controversial clues in the entire investigation. If the killer used materials from inside the Ramsey home to create the garrote, that suggested they either had time to search the house or were already familiar with its contents. And that possibility deeply complicated the intruder theory, because most kidnappers or burglars avoid spending unnecessary time inside a crime scene. The longer someone stays inside a crime scene, the greater the risk of being caught. Yet in this case, the offender appeared to have done several unusual things. They wrote a lengthy ransom note, they assembled a complex strangulation device, and they left the victim hidden in a small basement room. For many investigators, those actions suggested planning, or at least a strange level of comfort inside the house. But the forensic puzzle was far from complete, because while the autopsy revealed how JonBenet died, it didn't answer the most critical question of all. Who was responsible? Was it a sexual predator who had somehow entered the Ramsey home undetected, or was the crime part of a staged scene designed to mislead investigators? Over the next several months, detectives would begin examining every piece of evidence: fibers, handwriting samples, DNA traces, and witness statements. And as the investigation unfolded, one reality became increasingly clear. This was not going to be a simple case.
Because the more investigators looked at the evidence, the more contradictions they found. And those contradictions would soon divide detectives, forensic experts, and the public into two opposing camps: the intruder theory and the inside job theory. But the clues that fueled those theories would soon spark one of the most controversial investigations in modern criminal history.
The investigation into the murder of JonBenét Ramsey had barely begun when detectives faced an uncomfortable but unavoidable reality. In many child homicide cases, investigators are trained to begin with a difficult assumption. Statistically, the person responsible is often someone the victim knows, sometimes someone inside the home. And in the early days of the investigation in Boulder, Colorado, that statistical reality placed immediate attention on the people closest to JonBenét: her parents, John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey. According to investigators, questioning family members is a standard procedure in any homicide investigation, especially when the crime occurs inside the home. But in this case, the scrutiny quickly intensified. Detectives began reviewing the timeline of events from the night of December 25th, trying to determine whether anything in the Ramsey story didn't add up. They examined the ransom note. They analyzed the garrote used in the strangulation. They studied the layout of the house, and the more investigators looked at the evidence, the more complicated the picture became. One of the first details that caught detectives' attention was the ransom note itself. As previously revealed, the note had been written on paper from inside the Ramsey home, and forensic handwriting analysts were soon asked to examine the letter. According to investigators, samples of handwriting were collected from multiple individuals, including Patsy Ramsey. Experts began comparing the ransom note to her writing style. The results, however, were anything but straightforward. Some analysts claimed certain letter formations appeared similar. Others argued there was not enough evidence to make a definitive match. But even the possibility of a connection immediately fueled suspicion. Because investigators were struggling to understand a key question. If an intruder had committed the crime, why would they take the time to sit down inside the house and write a 2.5-page ransom note? Behavioral analysts later pointed out that most kidnappers prepare ransom demands in advance. Writing such a long message inside the victim's home would dramatically increase the risk of being caught, which led some investigators to consider another possibility. What if the ransom note was not written by an outsider at all? What if it was staged after the crime had already happened? That theory would become one of the most controversial elements of the case. But the ransom note wasn't the only piece of evidence drawing attention towards the family. Detectives also questioned the events of that morning. Why had friends and neighbors been invited into the house so quickly? Why had the ransom note's instructions, specifically the warning not to contact police, been ignored immediately? And perhaps most importantly, why had John Ramsey discovered his daughter's body only after a second search of the home was requested? For investigators attempting to reconstruct the timeline, every detail mattered. Even small inconsistencies could become crucial. But as detectives continued their questioning, the case was no longer confined to police interview rooms. It had exploded into the national media. Television networks began broadcasting images of JonBenét from her child beauty pageants. Newspapers ran front-page headlines questioning how such a crime could happen inside an affluent family home. And very quickly, public speculation began focusing on the Ramseys themselves. Were they victims of a horrific tragedy, or were they hiding something? For John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey, the accusations were devastating. The couple publicly denied any involvement in their daughter's death. Through interviews and statements, they maintained their innocence and insisted an intruder had entered their home that night. In several television appearances, the Ramseys described themselves as grieving parents caught in the middle of a nightmare. They argued that investigators had rushed to judge them rather than focusing on finding the real killer. And over time, their defense team would aggressively challenge many of the assumptions made during the investigation. But the pressure from the public and the media never stopped. Talk shows debated the evidence. True crime commentators analyzed the ransom note. Former detectives offered conflicting opinions. Some believed the case pointed strongly towards an inside job. Others insisted that certain forensic clues suggested the possibility of an intruder. The truth seemed buried beneath layers of speculation, media coverage, and investigative mistakes. And behind it all was a tragic reality. A 6-year-old girl had been murdered, and no one had been charged. But as detectives continued examining the evidence, a new and unexpected development would soon complicate the case even further. Because years later, advances in forensic technology would uncover a clue investigators had been waiting for since the very beginning: DNA. And what that DNA revealed would reopen the debate about what really happened inside the Ramsey house that night. The murder investigation into JonBenét Ramsey had already become one of the most controversial cases in American criminal history. For years, detectives debated the same central question: was the killer an intruder or someone inside the home? But as forensic technology advanced in the years following the crime, investigators returned to the evidence with a powerful new tool: DNA analysis. And what they discovered would complicate the case even further. During the forensic examination of JonBenét's clothing, scientists recovered trace genetic material. At first, the sample seemed small, almost insignificant. But forensic analysts knew that even the tiniest DNA fragment could hold enormous investigative value. Because DNA can do something eyewitness testimony often cannot. It can point to a specific individual or rule someone out entirely. When the laboratory results came back, investigators made a surprising discovery. The DNA did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. It did not match John Ramsey, it did not match Patsy Ramsey, and it did not match any known family members whose samples had been collected during the investigation. Instead, the genetic profile belonged to an unknown male. That revelation sent shockwaves through the case. For years, suspicion had heavily focused on the Ramseys themselves. But now, forensic evidence suggested that someone else, someone unidentified, may have been involved. To many observers, this appeared to support the intruder theory. If the DNA belonged to a stranger, it could indicate that an outsider had entered the Ramsey home that night. Perhaps someone who had been watching the family, someone who knew about JonBenét, someone who had been waiting for the right opportunity. But the situation wasn't that simple, because DNA evidence, especially trace DNA, can sometimes raise as many questions as it answers. Forensic experts began examining exactly where the DNA had been found. The unidentified male profile had been recovered from JonBenét's clothing, including areas that investigators believed may have been connected to the assault. On the surface, that seemed significant. But scientists also knew that secondary transfer can occur. In other words, DNA can sometimes be transferred indirectly, from objects, from clothing during manufacturing, or even through casual contact earlier in the day. That possibility forced investigators to consider a difficult question. Was the DNA left behind by the killer, or was it unrelated to the crime entirely? Forensic analysts spent years studying the genetic sample, attempting to determine its origin. Eventually, the profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, commonly known as CODIS, the national database used by law enforcement agencies across the United States to identify suspects in criminal investigations. If the unknown male had ever been arrested and had his DNA entered into the system, investigators hoped a match might appear. But year after year, no match came back. The profile remained unidentified. And that uncertainty created a deep divide among investigators and forensic experts. Some detectives believed the DNA was one of the strongest pieces of evidence pointing toward an intruder. After all, if someone outside the Ramsey family had left genetic material on the victim, that could indicate an unknown offender. But other investigators were far more cautious. They argued that the amount of DNA recovered was extremely small. Too small, perhaps, to confidently connect it to the person responsible for the crime. Some forensic specialists even warned that the sample could have been transferred long before the murder occurred. And if that were true, the DNA might have nothing to do with the killer at all. The debate became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire investigation. Years later, prosecutors and detectives continued to disagree about what the DNA actually proved. But one thing was certain. The evidence added another layer of mystery to a case that was already filled with contradictions. Because if the DNA belonged to the killer, it meant the true perpetrator had never been identified. And if it didn't belong to the killer, then investigators were still left searching for answers. For behavioral experts studying the case, the uncertainty made profiling the offender even more difficult. The crime scene contained elements of multiple offender types. There were signs of sexual violence, suggesting a potential predatory motive. There were indications of staging, including the strange ransom note. And there were details suggesting the offender may have been comfortable enough inside the house to spend time writing that note and constructing the garrote. Those behaviors didn't easily fit into one clear psychological profile. Instead, they suggested something far more complicated, possibly even multiple scenarios. And after nearly 30 decades, that complexity remains one of the reasons the case continues to fascinate and frustrate investigators around the world. Because despite thousands of interviews, years of forensic testing, and relentless media attention, the identity of the person whose DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing remains unknown. And until that mystery is solved, the question that has haunted this case since 1996 still remains. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey, and why? The final chapter of this investigation would attempt to answer that question. But the truth may be more complicated than anyone expected.
The murder of JonBenét Ramsey did not remain just another criminal investigation. Within days of the tragedy in Boulder, Colorado, the case exploded into a national and eventually international media phenomenon. What began as a local homicide investigation quickly transformed into one of the most scrutinized and debated murder cases in modern American history. Television networks interrupted regular programming to cover updates from the investigation. Newspapers ran front-page stories analyzing every new detail released by authorities. And almost overnight, the image of JonBenét, smiling in sparkling pageant costumes, became instantly recognizable across the world. For many people watching the story unfold, the contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side were the glamorous images of a young child performing in beauty pageants. On the other was the brutal reality of her murder inside her own home. That contradiction captured public attention in a way few cases ever had. But the intense media coverage also created a dangerous side effect: speculation. Almost immediately, the investigation became the subject of endless public debate. Talk shows invited former detectives, psychologists, and legal experts to analyze the evidence. News anchors questioned the behavior of the Ramsey family, and amateur investigators across the country began forming their own theories about what might have happened that night. Was the crime the work of a calculated intruder, or was it the result of something far more personal? The unanswered questions fueled fascination, and as weeks turned into months, the case only grew more mysterious. Journalists began uncovering new angles. They examined the controversial ransom note. They debated the forensic evidence. They scrutinized the timeline of the Ramsey family's movements on Christmas night. But despite the constant attention, one fact remained unchanged. no one had been charged with the murder. And that uncertainty opened the door to a flood of competing theories. Some investigators believed the evidence strongly pointed toward an intruder who had entered the house undetected. Others argued that certain elements of the crime, particularly the ransom note, suggested staging. In the absence of clear answers, speculation filled the void. Books were written analyzing the case from different perspectives. Television specials reconstructed the crime scene, and eventually an entire genre of true crime documentaries began revisiting the mystery again and again. Each new program promised fresh insight. Each claimed to reveal clues that previous investigators may have overlooked. But instead of resolving the case, these productions often deepened the debate, because every piece of evidence seemed capable of supporting multiple interpretations. For example, the ransom note. To some experts, its length and unusual wording suggested someone inside the house may have written it. But to others, the strange language could indicate a psychologically disturbed intruder attempting to mislead investigators. The same uncertainty surrounded the DNA evidence. Some believed it proved the presence of an unknown male attacker. Others argued the sample was too small to draw definitive conclusions. In many ways, the case became a mirror reflecting the perspectives of those studying it. Detectives saw investigative puzzles. Psychologists saw behavioral patterns. Journalists saw contradictions in the timeline. And the public saw a mystery that refused to be solved. But perhaps the most powerful force keeping the story alive was something far simpler: emotion. For many people, the idea that a 6-year-old child could be murdered in her own home without justice was deeply unsettling. It created a sense of unfinished business, a question that refused to fade with time. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey? And how could such a high-profile investigation remain unsolved for decades? Over the years, advances in forensic science gave investigators new tools. DNA databases expanded. Cold case units reopened old files, and modern analysts revisited the original evidence using technologies that didn't exist in 1996. Each new development raised hope that the mystery might finally be solved. But as of today, the identity of JonBenét's killer has never been confirmed. The case remains officially unsolved. And yet, nearly 29 years later, the story continues to captivate investigators, journalists, and audiences around the world. Because beyond the theories, the headlines, and the documentaries, there is still a fundamental truth at the center of this case. A child lost her life, and the person responsible has never been held accountable. Which raises one final question. After 29 years of investigation, mistakes, and new forensic breakthroughs, are we any closer to the truth? Or is the answer to the JonBenét Ramsey mystery still hiding somewhere within the evidence? If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep-dive documentaries.
Nearly 3 decades after the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, the case remains one of the most famous unsolved homicides in the United States. But despite the passage of time, investigators insist the case is not closed. Inside evidence storage rooms in Boulder, Colorado, boxes of physical evidence collected in 1996 still exist, carefully preserved. Fibers, clothing, photographs, forensic reports. Each item represents a piece of a puzzle that detectives have been trying to solve for nearly 30 years. And now, new technology may finally offer answers that investigators could only dream of when the crime first occurred. In 1996, DNA analysis was still in its early stages. Testing required relatively large samples, and even then the results were often limited. But today, forensic science has changed dramatically. Modern laboratories can analyze extremely small fragments of DNA, sometimes only a few cells, using techniques that didn't exist during the original investigation. This advancement has given cold case detectives renewed hope. According to investigators, new forensic methods such as genetic genealogy may allow scientists to trace unknown DNA profiles through distant relatives stored in public databases. The same method has helped solve dozens of cold cases in recent years. Perhaps the most famous example was the identification of the suspect in the Golden State Killer case, where investigators used genealogy databases to track a suspect decades after the crimes were committed. For detectives working the JonBenét Ramsey case, that breakthrough changed the conversation. If the unidentified male DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing truly belongs to the killer, genetic genealogy could eventually lead investigators directly to his identity. But the process isn't simple. Before that kind of analysis can happen, forensic experts must ensure the DNA sample is suitable for advanced testing, and that question has been debated for years. Some forensic specialists believe the sample is strong enough to generate a usable genetic profile. Others remain cautious, arguing that the amount of DNA recovered is extremely small and may have been transferred indirectly. Still, the possibility of modern testing has sparked renewed interest in the case. Over the years, investigators have repeatedly revisited the physical evidence, hoping that technological improvements could reveal something previously hidden. And occasionally, those reviews have uncovered new details. Small clues that once seemed insignificant have been re-examined using modern forensic tools. Fibers have been compared again. Trace materials have been tested using updated laboratory methods. And detectives have continued interviewing witnesses and reviewing old tips. Because in cold cases, even the smallest overlooked detail can sometimes unlock the truth. At the same time, public pressure has continued to grow. Many supporters of the Ramsey family have called for additional independent DNA testing, arguing that new technology could finally clear up the mystery surrounding the unidentified genetic profile. Others believe investigators should expand the search by re-examining potential suspects who were never fully eliminated. Nearly 30 years later, the case still sparks intense debate among investigators, forensic scientists, and true crime researchers. Some believe the evidence still points toward an intruder who entered the house that night. Others remain convinced that the crime scene contains signs of staging that suggest a more complicated scenario. And because the case was surrounded by media attention, investigative errors, and conflicting interpretations of the evidence, separating fact from speculation has always been difficult. But what keeps detectives returning to the case is something far more powerful than media attention. It's the possibility that the truth is still hidden somewhere inside the evidence, somewhere in the fibers, somewhere in the DNA, somewhere in the details that investigators may not yet fully understand. Cold cases have a way of lingering for years, sometimes decades, before suddenly breaking open. A new witness comes forward, a forgotten piece of evidence is re-examined, or a technological breakthrough reveals something that investigators couldn't see before. For the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, that moment may still be coming. Because as long as the evidence exists, and as long as forensic science continues to evolve, the possibility of solving the case remains alive. And for many investigators, there is still one question that must eventually be answered. Who entered that house on Christmas night in 1996? Who wrote the mysterious ransom note? And who was responsible for the death of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey? Nearly 30 years later, the investigation continues. And somewhere within the evidence, the truth may still be waiting to be discovered. If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep-dive documentaries.
Nearly 3 decades after the death of JonBenét Ramsey, the case remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American criminal history. The evidence is still there. The ransom note, the unidentified DNA, the unanswered questions inside the house in Boulder, Colorado. Investigators have analyzed the crime from every angle: intruder theories, forensic clues, psychological profiles. Yet the identity of the person responsible for JonBenét's death has never been definitively confirmed. But cold cases have a strange way of resurfacing. As forensic technology continues to evolve, detectives believe the truth may still be hidden somewhere within the evidence. And if that day comes, one of the most debated cases in modern history may finally have an answer. Until then, the question remains: who killed JonBenét Ramsey? If you're interested in real investigative crime stories like this one, consider subscribing for more deep dive documentaries.